Center for Educational Neuroscience seminar. It's my great pleasure to welcome Professor Jo van Herwegen to give this week's seminar. Jo is Professor of Developmental Psychology and Education at the Institute of Education in UCL's Faculty for Education and Society, and she is Director of the Child Development and Learning Difficulties Lab and Deputy Director of the Center for Educational Neuroscience. Her research focuses on improving educational outcomes, especially for those with learning difficulties and neurodevelopmental conditions, using evidence from developmental psychology and educational neuroscience. She has evaluated targeted interventions for those with SEND issues and best practice around SEND code of practice, school transitions, and inclusion for those with SEND and CPD for educational staff. Jo has co-edited 2 books and has written over 70 peer-reviewed articles and book chapters. She's currently member of the board for the European Association for Research on Learning and Instruction. Jo is talking to us today on addressing educational attainment gaps for students with SEND through targeted interventions, and she'll be telling us about the MetaSENse project. So I'll hand over to Jo, and if you have any questions as you go along, please put them in the chat bar, and then I'll ask them at the end of the talk. So over to you, Jo.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for having me today. I hope you can all see my slides and the technology is working. Excellent. So before we start, I might want to start with how we define special educational needs and disabilities. And I'm going to start with the definition that is used by the Department for Education in England, which talks about SEND with disabilities at the end. Some people look at it as SEN, S-A-N. I'm going to probably use the two in between depending on the project. But basically, we're talking about 4 categories of needs that children may have. First of all, being communication and interaction needs, such as autism and students with speech, language, and communication needs. And then the second category is students who might have cognition and learning difficulties, including disabilities such as dyslexia, dysgraphia, dyscalculia, and then those with neurodevelopmental conditions such as Down syndrome. And as some of you know, I do a lot of research on Williams syndrome and sometimes also Sotos syndrome. In the third category, we find students with socio-emotional and mental health difficulties. Think about attention, ADHD, or socio-emotional behavioral disabilities, SEBD. And then last but not least, those with physical and sensory needs, such as vision impairment, hearing impairment, and sometimes also referred to as blindness or deafness. And in the UK or in England, that is not necessarily a small proportion of students, because at the moment, these are the numbers from 2023, there's about 13% of students that have additional special educational needs, difficulties or need support within the school. And 4.3% of these students, or that's about 390,000 students, need additional support. So they have an education, health and care plan, meaning that they have additional support, often in the form of targeted interventions. And that's what I'm going to talk about later on today. So again, we're not talking about an insignificant number of students that require additional support in the school. And the reason why I'm focusing on these students is because these students tend to have lower educational outcomes compared to those students who do not have SEND. So this is a figure from Sam Tuckett in 2021. And on the right, you can see the gap between students with SEND without an EHCP, the dotted line, and those with an EHCP. And as you can see for both these groups, whether we're talking about gap in grades or gap in months, we can see a significant gap for these students, as much even as for students who have an EHCP, it might be as much as 40 months or more at the end when they are reaching their GCSEs when they're about 16 years old. There's also more recent evidence from the same Education Policy Institute to suggest that this gap might actually be growing as a result of the COVID pandemic. But this gap doesn't start to appear just at the end. There is now more evidence suggesting that this gap starts really early onwards in their education trajectory. So a very recent study by Daniel and colleagues at the University of Durham shows that even when these children are in year 6, So, you know, at the end of primary school, there is a significant effect, so a significant delay or a reduction in outcomes between those with SEND compared to those without SEND. And that is specifically the case for mathematics, where we see that this gap continues to increase over time, but there is also a significant gap for overall performance and for reading performance. And even when we go a little bit younger, to the early years foundation stage profile, what we see there is that 19% of children with SEN achieve a good level of development, and that is 6% lower than the figure for the years before. But also, if we then compare this to who are the children that meet the expected standard according to the teacher assessment, again, we see that students with SEN have a significant lower number of students who meet that target compared to those who do not have SEND. And that's the case for reading, for writing, and for maths. So most students with SEND have significant lower outcomes than those without SEND, and this gap forms very early on in development. So the question is, what are barriers and solutions then to raising educational outcomes? And today I'm going to talk a little bit about, you know, what does that mean about teacher training and knowledge? Are there any issues related to translation? And what about the current evidence base about how we can raise these students' outcomes? And maybe if I've got time at the end, talk a little about educational neuroscience and SEND, what educational neuroscience can tell us about raising these outcomes. So when we look at teacher knowledge, there's been a number of studies, including some of our own studies, showing that teachers have knowledge about some groups of students with SEND, so, you know, autism, ADHD, and dyslexia. But when it comes to other groups of SEND, think about developmental coordination disorder or even developmental language disorder, especially dyscalculia and Down syndrome, then we see that there's a significant gap in that most teachers are not very familiar or only slightly familiar with what these conditions actually mean. We've done some other research to suggest that although teachers might sometimes, when it comes to, for example, autism or Down syndrome, they might be able to highlight some of the needs of these children or the difficulties these children may have. For example, highlighting that autistic students might have problems with social development, but they might not necessarily be able to kind of then say, what does that mean for learning? Or what does that mean for the type of specialist support that these students then need? So it's about making sure that teachers not only have knowledge about these conditions, but that they also have knowledge about what do we then do in order to help these children within a classroom setting. And we're not the only ones who've identified this kind of research practice gap. A study by Pegram and colleagues, for example, looked at, if we look at what kind of interventions are being used within classroom settings, and they looked at 10 different schools in Wales, they found that of the 138 interventions that were being used by these schools, 67% had no published research evidence to support whether this intervention is actually a good intervention or not. And what was interesting is, and we see that in other studies as well, that most teachers very much recognize the importance of research evidence and to implement classroom practices that are supported by research. But very often they're not very confident about how to engage with that research, how to access that research. A lot of that research is often behind publication walls, etc. And even when they then have access, the question is, how do you read these kind of statistical results sections? A final barrier I wanted to highlight is also around, okay, so one is about getting access to this evidence, and some of that access can be done through continued professional development when teachers are already in practice. However, what we did find in one of the surveys we did a few years ago is that when it comes to what kind of CPD is being prioritized in schools, we find that SEND-related CPD is often not a priority, and it kind of falls to the bottom of the list. Not only does it not occur maybe as frequently as some of the teachers and staff would like, but it's kind of like when we then think about, but what CPD is being offered in relation to SEND, we find that SEND CPD is not always matched to the type of students that the school is catering for. So there is kind of a lack of strategic thinking around how do we plan our CPD for SEND, basing on maybe external or internal drivers within the school. And then finally, when SEND CPD is implemented in schools, it's not always evaluated in terms of, was that CPD useful? Is it making a change to the staff within the school? Now, teacher training might be one issue, teacher knowledge might be one issue. When we look at the current evidence basis, we know already quite a bit in terms of, there's a lot of research out there about different conditions or students with SEND, in terms of, we know that there is, many of them are genetic, there might be some subtypes. We do know there's a lot of comorbidity between them. We are better at identifying the age of onset, or at least the age of diagnosis seems to get lower and lower. And there's some kind of general knowledge that we can say is kind of, there's consensus. For example, this consensus that despite variability, phonological deficits seem to be core to dyslexia, or that there might be some issues around theory of mind reasoning. Maybe we should rephrase that. Really, not everybody agrees it's theory of mind, but that there are some social difficulties related to autism. And then even for some rare genetic syndromes like Williams syndrome, we know quite a bit. For example, the fact that they appear highly sociable, but then they might mask high anxiety. So when it comes to this kind of basic research, we know there's quite a lot of research being done and quite a lot of evidence, or already a little bit of consensus out there. But there are still some gaps. I'm highlighting here a report that I was part of, which was led by Emily Farron. This is called the Shape Research Change Lives, a priority setting exercise for people with genetic syndromes. And we looked at, what kind of research is being done when we look at Down syndrome, Williams syndrome, and Fragile X. And then what do the people with lived experiences, so the parents, the young people who might have Williams syndrome, Down syndrome, and Fragile X, and the professionals who support these individuals, what do they think about this research evidence that is out there? And as you can see here on the left, we see is that there's a lot of knowledge around co-occurring conditions. There's a lot about cognition. 22% of the research focuses on that. We see that there's research about biology in the brain. That's this blue area here, about 13%. The darker blue is about diagnosis. So a lot around the kind of basic science. But when we then look at, for example, what do we know about treatment and interventions? Only 9% of studies focus on that. And even if we look at, societal issues, we go down to 3%. And if we look at, I was trying to think, the lifespan issues, we see it's only about 1% or less. So when it comes about how do we support these people within society, we know very little about that. When we then ask people about, what are your priorities, we can see clearly that knowing more about what treatments and interventions can help individuals with these genetic syndromes is top one, followed by mental health, knowing more about mental health issues and how they can be supported in their mental health. And then further down, it's medical issues, further training and awareness and opportunities for adults. And then we had another couple of categories that didn't make it to the top. But as you can see, there's kind of this mismatch between what we are researching and what individuals with lived experiences or those with lived experiences say is required. Now, we know there is some research out there in terms of how we can support individuals with special educational needs and disabilities in the classroom. There are some most of that support, before I move on, most of that support is kind of tiered, or we talk about it in a tiered way, where we think about, well, you can think about universal support, such as high quality teaching or whole school environment, supportive environment. And then we have kind of in tier 2, the targeted interventions that are a little bit more targeted to the needs of specific groups or conditions or specific needs. And at the top in tier 3, we have the specialist support that involves support from, for example, educational psychologists, speech and language therapists, etc. And there are some organizations that have already provided some evidence-based resources and frameworks, thinking, for example, the Communication Trust, the Dyslexia and SPLD Trust, the Autism Education Trust, the Council for Disabled Children, etc. Another one, for example, that many of the teachers who we interviewed, and I'll talk a bit more about that later on, is the EEF, but they talk more in terms of universal support that's out there for individuals with SEND and how to support these students in the classroom. We have a nice database by the Interventions for Literacy organization that is done by the Dyslexia and SPLD Trust. In terms of what language interventions, targeted interventions have been evaluated and are out there. And then we have the whole school network, what works, that kind of provides lots of information about how children can be supported. But in this database, it's not necessarily targeted approaches, or there's a lot of different approaches involved in it. So we know students with SEND have difficulties in terms of educational outcomes. We know that, teachers require more knowledge around what works and would like to know more about what works. And we know that there are some databases out there, there's some evidence out there, but it's not always quite clear where to find that evidence, especially because the resources I've just shown you don't always disentangle targeted interventions from universal provision. They don't always specifically focus on SEND alone. Sometimes they talk about students who have below average attainment, and it's unclear whether for these students they might catch up with more or better universal provision, and whereas others who might have, more significant SEND and need targeted support might, for them it might not be enough. And we also know that, there might be overlap between different students. And so it might be interesting to kind of look at what happens for students who have dyslexia and speech and language needs, or who have dyslexia and dyscalculia. For those students who have comorbidities, or where there's overlap between SEND needs, what kind of targeted interventions might work for them? And that was kind of the starting point for us for the study that we called MetaSENse. So MetaSENse is a study that had 4 aims. The first aim was to examine what works to improve academic outcomes for pupils with SEND. So which targeted interventions have been evaluated and can improve academic outcomes, and then for what kind of groups. What characteristics do these interventions have? Which ones lead to greater effectiveness? Secondly, we want to identify where are the gaps in the research, what evidence is missing and for whom. But also think about methodological issues which often occur when we look at SEND and interventions that have been evaluated. But also importantly, how do educational professionals select which targeted interventions to use, and what are the barriers to improve, effective strategies or to implement effective strategies? So in our study, we had 3 phases. The first phase looked at was a systematic review followed by a meta-analysis that looked at what targeted interventions, so these are randomized controlled trials and QEDs, have evaluated what works to raise educational outcomes for different students with SEND aged 4 to 25. And we followed PRISMA guidelines and pre-registered our methodologies through the Open Science Framework. In the second phase, we did in-depth interviews with practitioners to identify any education barriers that educational professionals might face. And in the last one, we then co-produced a database, and I hope I have time enough to talk you through all of those 3. So as I mentioned, in phase 1, we had a systematic review and meta-analysis. We searched 8 databases and 13 sources of grey literature. We looked at literature published between January 2000 and February 2023. We didn't expect to find much. And we focused on students with aged 4 to 25. And we only included interventions when they were a targeted intervention approach that included a taught element. We originally thought of maybe distinguishing between tier 2 and tier 3 interventions, but when we looked more deeper in the literature, it became clear that it's not always quite clear which one is delivered by an educational specialist at tier 3 compared to tier 2. And as I mentioned, we only looked at control trials, so RCTs and QEDs, so we could look more into the causality. But we didn't put any restrictions on the type of control group. So it could be an active control group or a teaching as usual. But we didn't include any kind of pharmacological treatment-based controls. In terms of our outcomes, we looked at reading, writing, mathematics, as well as science, and then also general attainment, so GCSEs, A-levels, etc. Originally, we wanted to include attention and motivational-based outcomes, but you'll see later on why we had to exclude these. And we were also originally interested in behavioral outcomes, such as attendance and bullying and organization, but again, we had to exclude these. We evaluated the studies that we looked at in terms of their quality using the Joanna Briggs quality assessment tools. So we used one for RCTs and one for QEDs. And then because there are a different number of items in each of these, we assessed study quality as either being low, moderate, or high. So we could make direct comparisons. In terms of our meta-analysis, we combined all results into a summary effect size because some of these studies had more than one outcome, for example. And we looked at Hedges G because most of the studies, as you'll see, had a very small sample sizes. We didn't only just look at the overall sample size, we also want to see about how this sample size was affected by the type of SEND that was included, the type of educational setting the intervention took place at, so whether that was mainstream, in special schools, in a clinical environment, or a mixed environment, so some at school, but some in a clinic or an after-school club. Phase of education, some were across phases, and then the delivery style. So whether the intervention was delivered on an individual or one-to-one level, small group settings, whole classroom approaches, or a combination of them. So some being one-to-one, but some taking part as a whole classroom. As I mentioned, we didn't think we were going to find a lot, seeing on what was out there in terms of people saying there is not a lot known about this, and most research focuses on basic research. Actually, when we did our search, we ended up with 467 studies that just looked at educational outcomes alone, but it means we've screened more than 55,000 texts, and whole texts, we screened more than 4,000 of them. So there was quite a lot of screening involved. And I need to thank already, before I forget, all of the people that were involved in the screening. So in terms of, our findings, so what did we find that works? Well, overall, we found that if you put everything on a pile, you find that in targeted interventions have an overall effect of 0.44, which is, if you use the EEF equivalence of 5 months of progress. What is positive is that you can see that all of them are above 0. So it shows that overall, there is an effect for overall attainment. There were 53 outcomes only. We have lots of outcomes on reading, and you can see there's a positive effect with smaller scores there. We have some for maths, 284, and some for writing, but all fall on the positive side of the line. We also find some positive findings for some SEND groups. So again, overall, we're looking at 1,758 outcomes. We find positive effects for ADHD, for dyslexia, for moderate learning difficulties, mathematical difficulties, and mixed SEN, as well as speech, language, and communication needs. But you can see that for other groups, the evidence is more mixed if we're looking at those with writing difficulties, hearing impairments, Down syndrome, and autism, for example. And some groups have very little evidence. SEMH kind of makes sense. We looked at educational outcomes. We know that these students have educational difficulties, but of course, most of the interventions might be focusing on the behavioral aspects of these students rather than the educational outcomes specifically. Other interesting findings is the fact that the phase of education seemed to matter for mathematics and writing. But for writing, we didn't find any differences in terms of the effect size when we compared primary to secondary to across phases outcomes. Whereas for maths, we found that the outcomes in primary schools were larger than the outcomes of studies that included students across all phases of education. And for writing, we found larger outcomes for students who were in secondary school than students who were in primary schools. In terms of educational setting, we found a significant effect for those in mainstream school compared to in specialist school, but there were no differences between the different groups for, we found a difference in mainstream school for being higher for mathematical outcomes compared to other types of settings, but that wasn't the case for other educational outcomes. So there was no effect for reading or for writing or for general attainment. And finally, a group and individual delivery methods did not differ for reading and mathematics, and actually for writing also not, once we took out some outliers. So what it shows is that whether the intervention overall, whether the intervention was delivered on an individual basis or small group basis, did not seem to affect the effect size. Of course, there were a number of gaps that we identified. So as you can see, first of all, here on the right, if we look at the number of studies published per year that were included in our meta-analysis or in our review, you'll see that indeed the number of studies per year has been going up, which is a good thing. So we are evaluating more about what works. But of course, we're only talking about 40 studies per year across the entire globe. So that's not a lot. This one is not an outlier. This was the end of our screening, and we finished screening in February, so that's why this number is so low in 2023. So the number of studies is increasing, but it is still low. And especially if we look at how many of these studies were evaluated in the UK, we only found 21 studies that met our inclusion criteria. And then there are some other biases within the findings in terms of that we know most of these studies focus on primary school students, and most of these studies are focusing on mainstream settings. There are also some other gaps in terms of who is targeted within these studies. So if we think about, we found most of our studies focus on dyslexia and reading difficulties for about 40%. Most of the outcomes focused on reading as well, that's 64% of them. And most of these interventions are only implemented for like a term, so between 1 and 12 weeks. So we have very few studies, of course, there's always outliers, that actually evaluate the impact of interventions across a longer time, like say a whole school year or even more. And in terms of the quality of the studies, the majority of the studies do not report significant or sufficient demographic characteristics such as SES and ethnicity. So we were not able to kind of take that into account or say anything about the impact of those characteristics on effective outcomes. What did surprise us, though, is that the studies that were included in our systematic review and meta-analysis is that most of these studies are moderate quality and even meet the criteria for high quality, with only a small proportion being studies that are low quality. Now, that doesn't mean that there are no methodological issues with these studies. I mean, some of the main issues we found is that studies did not, for example, specify how participants were randomized into the groups and whether or not blinding of allocation was achieved. There was also a lack of information around what did the intervention implementation look like? Were people truthful to the intervention? And so, yeah, we need to get better at our communication issues, basically, and talk more about what happens within the interventions itself. So in terms of the conclusions we can draw from this review and meta-analysis, we kind of know that in targeted interventions overall, when you put them all together, seem to work, and they lead to an average of 5 months overall. Very few of them have very large effect sizes, and it's something we might want to think about in terms of what does that mean. We do find higher effect sizes for mathematics than for reading, and that could be maybe explained by the fact that most of the maths interventions were very targeted on one particular aspect of mathematics, whereas most of the reading interventions were more broader and maybe be more, in terms of a further transfer, measuring a further transfer effect already. Interventions can work equally well in one-to-one as in group settings and across ages. There seems to be very little effect in terms of who implements the intervention. But we need to, the data for some of these groups is quite skewed. Most studies focus on reading. We know very little about particular groups other than dyslexia and reading difficulties, especially those who have more like significant learning difficulties, so moderate and severe learning difficulties, or those who have sensory needs and impairments. And there seems to be a lack also about knowing how we support these students in secondary school environments. So I think we can conclude from this that overall there's some promising evidence out there, but we do need larger trials, especially those based in the UK. So I want to move on then to phase 2, which is the interviews that we had. We did some online interviews with practitioners, and you'll see in a minute who we included. So these lasted around 35 to 45 minutes. And we asked the interviewees to reflect on the targeted intervention approaches they're using in their schools, how they arrived at those approaches, what evidence they used to implement these or to choose these, and then how they monitored effectiveness of the interventions. Did they use any assessments before and after the interventions? And when did they or how did they reviewed which targeted approaches should be replaced? So we included 32 participants. Most of them were aged between 30 and 49. They had quite a number of years of experience, on average about almost 9 years, but it was a wide range. We did not include anyone who was in their first year of teaching. And we had teachers and head teachers and specialists from mainstream, special and primary, mainstream and special, as well as schools that might combine mainstream and SEND or had like an SEND unit. And the same for secondary schools. So again, we had a mixture of mainstream and special, as well as mixed schools. And then we had some schools who, catered for across all phases of education. So there were 3 main themes that were identified through the interviews. We used thematic analysis to analyze the data. The first theme was around exploring and evaluating evidence for interventions, and I'll go into detail in a minute. Theme 2 was about balancing fidelity and adaptation in implementing interventions, especially related to students' individual needs and how training related to that, as well as kind of the structural and financial considerations in terms of choosing which interventions to use. And then the final theme related to monitoring the effectiveness of the intervention. So looking at what kind of assessment strategies were used, as well as how teachers and practitioners reflected on which targeted interventions to continue to use or how and when to review the targeted interventions. So in theme 1, we looked at, the theme that came out was exploring and evaluating evidence. And what we found was that most practitioners acknowledged the importance of using evidence-based interventions, but there seemed to be an inconsistent understanding of what evidence means. So some mentioned that they read peer-reviewed academic research, but others kind of weren't quite clear what evidence is and referred to, well, I know something works because I've seen it work in another school or with other children. So a lot of the information that schools seem to be using in terms of selecting interventions was using word of mouth and then seeing whether they worked for us or not, as this teacher said in the quote. There seemed to be a limited awareness around randomized controlled trials, or at least thinking about why do we need a control group, or why might we want to compare one intervention to another to kind of get more reliable evidence base of what works. Many of the teachers, of course, as I hinted on before, mentioned the challenge of accessing research evidence, but also having the time to read that evidence and understand that evidence. In terms of the second theme, we see that balancing fidelity and adaptation and implementing intervention is a difficulty for teachers. Like we found that most of the interventions were adapted to the teacher's needs. And it was not that the educators weren't aware that you need to stay kind of focused on the intervention, that you can't drift too far off what the targeted intervention is supposed to do. But teachers kind of felt conflicted between, but for my students, they're a little bit different and we might need to change the intervention a little bit. That was especially the case in special schools and for more experienced practitioners who wanted to kind of take the intervention and then see how they could adapt it to make it more easier to use within their context. But of course, this kind of flexibility then compromises the fidelity of the original intervention. Other issues that might that came up in terms of that might affect the fidelity of the interventions were the fact that teachers mentioned that the training of these targeted interventions often happened through a cascading kind of training approach, and that there was often a high staff turnover in terms of, and that knowledge would be lost when a teacher who was trained in a particular targeted approach would then leave the school, and so there was no one really who had been trained on the original delivery of the targeted intervention. And so, we did see that there were some differences between the schools in terms of, how flexibility was prioritized. We found that secondary schools remained kind of more true to the interventions, or tried to do that. They preferred something more off the shelf compared to primary schools. And again, we see that mainstream schools, again, preferred something more off the shelf or staying true to the target interventions, whereas specialist schools were keener to kind of say, I want to know what works for my school, for my students. And across, again, we see differences in terms of whether they required something off the shelf, so manualized interventions that require minimal training. Again, we see a difference between secondary versus primary and mainstream versus specialist. And then the final theme that came out was about monitoring effectiveness of the interventions. So most practitioners, they did tell us that they were monitoring the intervention's effectiveness, and that they used a range of pre and post assessment measures, sometimes belonging to the targeted interventions, or it was part of the targeted intervention. Then again, it wasn't clear whether that assessment had a good reliability or validity, but others kind of, it wasn't quite clear what they were using. One of the interesting things was that it wasn't quite clear what the teachers then did with that information, and how that information was maybe used in terms of evaluating which targeted interventions might not just work for Jake, but also work for other children within that classroom or within the school, for example. I think this is where that already mentioned. So the monitoring and the evaluation process of these targeted interventions was not always done systematically. And there was a lot of relying a lot on informal methods to kind of see if an intervention should remain as part of the toolkit that was part of the school or not. And also what schools were not really monitoring was the adaptations that they were making or the adaptations they were making of these targeted interventions. So to conclude the second phase, we see that there's research evidence that there are a number of barriers in terms of accessing the research, but also understanding the research evidence. We see that a number of interventions approaches are used, and that they welcome approaches that are implemented flexibly and can be adapted to the students' needs, as well as those that require less training. We didn't find many differences between educational practitioners themselves in terms of how much training they had, but we did see differences between primary and secondary school staff and between mainstream and special schools. That leads us to the third part of the study, which was the toolkit that we created. And this toolkit was co-created with the 33 members of staff that we interviewed. And I hope it's going to work. So this is a video that explains it, basically.
Okay. Let's say that you're interested in finding out what targeted interventions can be used for students in Key Stage 1 to improve their mathematical abilities. The MetaSENse database can help you with this. So if you go to the MetaSENse website and you go to the toolkit and you fill out your detail and also your email address, this is just so we can track who has been using the database and in what capacity. And as you can see, there are many options in terms of how we can select the targeted interventions that have been evaluated within the MetaSENse database. So I'm going to select that I'm interested in improving mathematical outcomes for students in Key Stage 1. And then we're going to go and search. And then, as you can see, the database gives you a nice overview of all of the targeted interventions that have been evaluated and have been included in the database. Those that are included in the database are those that are available to teachers. And we can now look at which ones we might want to explore a bit further. So some, as you will see, improve mathematical outcomes, but also have other benefits. We can also see what the quality of the evidence is, as well as what the outcome was effective or not so effective, or insufficient evidence, meaning that more information is needed. And then if we pick one in, for example, over here, the digits and plus games, what you'll see here is that there's a description of what the approach entails, how it works, which children it might benefit, what dosage should be delivered, as well as an overview of what does the evidence tell us, as well as the full reference as well. And then there is a link you can click to download the manual.
I think this is where we cut off the video a bit too quickly, but that's not a bad thing. I'm going to skip through the next one. So this is kind of, in sum, this was what we did in this project. And we hope that the database will allow for teachers, as well as parents, as well as other educational professionals, to make informed decisions, research-informed decisions about what targeted interventions to implement in their settings. So to round up, so that we allow time for questions, we know that educational outcomes for students with SEND are lower, and that there's one of the things I didn't mention is we know that there's a growing number of students with SEND, and that's a specific challenge, especially in England, in terms of certain local authorities. We know that there's a growing literature on what works for students with SEND to raise educational outcomes, but that not all teachers will have access to that literature or might have the time to digest that literature. And also teachers might not always be aware on how to evaluate what works or how to access the evidence. And so we hope that the MetaSENse database can help parents and teachers to make these research and informed decisions. We did have, on the back of the MetaSENse project, a few recommendations I would like to share with you. So especially because there's a number of academics here in the audience, so we hope that academics will help us to kind of invest more in terms of a balanced evidence basis. We know a lot about reading, but we know a little bit about writing, and we know very little about science or other educational outcomes. We also think that this kind of evaluation is sometimes difficult to do, and it seems that we need to think about better ways or opportunities that will allow collaborations between researchers and educational practitioners. There seems to be that a lot of data out there in the real world, in classrooms, that we maybe are not being able to look at or harvest, that might be very informative. We would also, we see that from the interviews that some of the educational practitioners really would like to have more training around how to evaluate information of what works within their classroom. And this is something that maybe higher education providers could look at in terms of ensuring that practitioners have more training around evaluating evidence and what works in classrooms. And mainly, we should encourage policymakers to establish a new national database that would kind of include more of these outcomes of SEND interventions, not only about those that are evaluated within peer-reviewed research, but also the data that teachers are using or collecting within their settings, and it seems to be not being used at the moment. Of course, we see this as the first step, and we're very pleased that we can't go into too much detail yet, but we've got some further funding to look at critical components that are part of these target interventions, so we can kind of get a better understanding of what critical components might benefit reading or maths or writing, but also what critical components might benefit certain groups compared to others. There are many toolkits and advice out there. I've mentioned a few already in my talk. There are many others out there as well, but maybe we need to start thinking about, is there a need for a trusted source where all evidence has been put together? And we would love to expand the the MetaSENse database, not only with newer studies, of course, that might have come out, but also looking at behavioral and well-being outcomes. So I'd like to thank you for listening today, and I'd like to thank all of the students and colleagues that have helped with this massive project and all the phases, and of course our funder, the Nuffield Foundation. And thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Joe. That was a fantastic presentation. We have a little time for questions. I'm going to take chair's prerogative and ask the first question, and it's going to be the toughest question. And after this, every other question is going to seem like a walk in the park.
Okay.
So in the United Kingdom, I don't know, possibly in other countries as well, we have a funding crisis in SEND. And partly this is due to the increasing rate of diagnosis. Do you think there's information in the MetaSENse project that will help educators with that problem, perhaps increase the efficiency of intervention, or how can these data help with the funding crisis?
Well, that's a great question. Thank you for asking that question. Okay, well, there's a couple of things that come to mind, and I'm going to forget the question at some point, right? Because I go through my. I think first of all, I know in some local authorities or in some schools, there is the idea that targeted intervention should be delivered in a one-to-one place, right? That's best. One-to-one setting is best. I know that's the case in other countries where some countries have taken that approach. One-to-one is best, but actually. It seems that if you have two targeted interventions and one is delivered one-to-one and content-wise they're quite similar and the other one is in small groups, it seems that you can do the small group intervention, meaning that you kind of decrease the waiting lists a little bit and students can benefit earlier than that. The second thing is that, as you said, in our database, it kind of says what interventions provide better effect sizes, higher effect sizes. So going through the database might allow teachers to say, what are we using in our practice at the moment? And is it effective? And can we do something else? For example, one head teacher was saying, we use Cochmet in our school. What is the evidence that Cochmet works? And if you go to the database, you'll find that we included 7 studies that evaluated Cochmet and that we don't find evidence that suggests that Cochmet makes big differences in terms of outcomes. But the database allows you then also to look for other metacognitive strategies or interventions that target working memory to see if they're maybe more effective. And then the next thing, which the database can't yet do, but we'll be able to do when we do the next step, is to look at, are there particular critical components that will give bigger effects, not for specific SEND groups, but more for groups overall. It wasn't included in our interventions because it's not necessary. Well, anyway, Lego intervention for Lego therapy, for example, we know there's evidence with Lego therapy that it might help with communication strategies. We know from recent research around mathematical abilities that playing with Lego, which is not really Lego therapy, might improve mathematical outcomes. But you can kind of see that maybe then providing Lego therapy might not only help students with communication difficulties, but might also help with improving mathematical outcomes. So there might be some interventions that are cheaper and might have benefits across different groups of students with different needs, for example. So it doesn't have to be as targeted maybe anymore. And that's exactly what teachers said, is that maybe the interventions aren't always as targeted as we think they are.
Super. Thanks very much. All right, no more questions from me, but plenty of questions in the chat. So firstly, from Sebastian, says, thank you for your excellent talk and work. I would appreciate to know if you identified publication bias in your review and meta-analysis, and in such a case, how it influences the results.
Great question. We did look at that and I didn't present it, apologies. But yeah, no, there was no publication bias in our results. So that was a good thing.
That's very good news. Yeah.
Exactly.
All right. Question from Melanie. Thank you for this great talk. We've already talked a bit about that, but I think it can also be interesting for today's audience. Do you plan to explore deeper the interventions included in the meta-analysis to identify the key ingredients of the most efficient interventions? I'm particularly interested in the potential of metacognitive components in these interventions. Do you have any results or expectations on that?
Great question, Melanie. Yes, so we've started doing this. So with one group of students, we're looking at the mathematical interventions to kind of see what are the components for those in more detail, like what areas do they target, because as we said, we found bigger effects for primary school than secondary school. Is that because certain components are targeted more and they're easier? Like, for example, I can imagine, I'm sorry, I'm talking about maths. I'll come to metacognition in a minute. Bear with me. Is in maths, for example, that if you do arithmetic, basic addition and subtraction might be easier than word problem solving, because it might require more of these other abilities like metacognitive strategies and language abilities, etc. And I'm hoping to do with Rebecca Gordon. I don't know if she's here today, but she was one of the collaborators to see if metacognitive strategies, like which ones are included and what does that mean in terms of effect sizes. The difficulty is we know that will probably, well, one of the questions we were interested in is whether that would differ for different types of SEND groups, but we don't have enough in terms of interventions and outcomes to look at that in terms of power. But yeah, there's definitely a need to explore. I mean, we've done like this kind of wider overview to see what's out there. And I think it's a big database. And we're always happy to collaborate with other colleagues as well to see what's in there and how we can mine the data more, basically.
Super, thank you. Question from Alexandra. Thank you so much, Joe. Amazing work. I was wondering what your thoughts were on why the number of intervention studies is so sparse with, for example, children with Down syndrome who have very compromised language skills.
Very good question. We've just finished writing up a paper on specifically looking at Down syndrome, and we found that there's only 6 interventions for students with Down syndrome, 4 looking at reading outcomes and 2 looking at mathematical outcomes, and with mixed results, shall we say, or very much looking at pilot studies. And it's interesting, I don't know why there are, I think funding is one particular difficulty for all of these studies. Any evaluation is very costly. There's a lot of resources involved. And I think this is where I've been trying to think of, we might want to collaborate with teachers in a different way so we can do these evaluations in a little bit more of an efficient way. At the moment, it's, researchers often coming up with an intervention or often coming up with, we're going to evaluate that and then have to recruit schools and decide on the pre and post measures. And that's all very cost intensive. With funders, sometimes we've just had a grant rejected because the funder said, are you sure you're going to be able to recruit the numbers of these children? And so I think maybe if we say, let's evaluate what schools are using, it might be a more efficient way of doing this. I don't know if that answers your question, but I think this is one explanation as to why this is. And then the other thing is, of course, that with rarer conditions, I mean, it's not that Down syndrome is very rare, but it's still rarer compared to dyslexia or dyscalculia, is that these children are then, they go to, that you might find 1 or 2 in each mainstream school or in each school. And again, it then makes a lot of, that there are a lot of practical difficulties to overcome to evaluate what works for these students.
Thanks. Debbie, you have your hand up. Do you want to turn your microphone on and jump in?
Yeah. Hi, Joe. Excellent talk. It's really interesting to hear about your work. I'm really interested in just this concept of intervention as well, and that can be deemed quite narrow. So you mentioned yourself that schools tend to have a preference for things that are manualised, and you talked about fidelity and the importance of sort of sticking to the script to ensure outcomes. And it just struck me that for some children, actually a much more student-centred approach and tailored approach to that individual will probably be most effective for them. The challenge then is for researchers is how do we evaluate that? Because that is not something that can be done well or proved to be effective in a randomised control trial or that type of thing. It's more sort of case study type approach. So an intervention or a sort of targeted teaching session might work for that child in that setting with that teacher, but you might not be able to prove that it's effective on a randomized control sort of trial basis because there's too many variables at play. So just interested in your view on that, and in terms of sort of how do we prove what works for individual children as opposed to what works as a, in a randomized control trial, which shows that it works on average for a group in a particular setting.
Great question, Debbie. Thanks very much for that. Yeah, we've had long debates around, you know, what should be included in terms of, you know, the type of methodologies. Now, I think individual case studies, they are, of course, very insightful and take a holistic approach. But the problem there is that how do you know that something really works if you don't have a control group? And for behavioral interventions, you can kind of do this case study where you give it and then you take it away, and you give it and you take it away, which kind of then gives you the control in terms of, well, this thing that we're doing is actually making a difference. But when you do this with cognition, well, you know, I'm hoping if I put something in and I've taught you something that you will no longer forget it. Otherwise, I'll have to make you actively forget what you've been taught. So that kind of case approach doesn't seem to be really good when we're talking about educational outcomes rather than maybe other outcomes. However, I do agree with you. There are two things I think we can do to kind of go beyond, you know, is it just for everybody in RCT, is be much better at evaluating what works for whom in an RCT rather than just looking at here's an effect size. Let's look at that. That will do. That, you know, but it's to kind of say who didn't benefit. So looking more of this kind of individual approaches, and is it those who were stronger originally improve more, or those who were weaker, or those who work with particular teachers, etc. And the second thing is, which I think will be much more powerful, is to say to teachers, look, we did this component analysis, and we know that if you've got an intervention that has positive feedback, that has a behavioral aspect to it, and that has X to it, if you've got these three combinations, right, you can change whatever you want, but don't change those three, because that's kind of the most powerful thing for this particular group. So it's not just saying target intervention means you start with A and you end with Z, but kind of knowing I can change it, but there are particular things I shouldn't change, I shouldn't touch, to make sure that the active ingredient is still there, kind of.
Super. I'm going to take a couple of questions from the chat, and then Gaia has her hand up. So we'll go to Gaia after that. So first, nice, tough question, this one. Paul asks, if Keir Starmer had included one SEND milestone in his presentation today, what should it have been?
Oh, 1 SEND milestone. Okay, here we go. But that's a very different talk I would have given then. But I would have given a talk around what do we know from educational neuroscience about SEND, which I didn't get to, which is the bit I cut from today's presentation. And it would be about looking at dimensions of learning needs. We know there's a few kind of dimensions. Thinking about executive functioning and metacognition are very important abilities or dimensions, you know, that are predictive of learning needs without needing a diagnosis. We know language is another one of those. And to say to Keir Starmer, if you want to fix the problem, don't focus on labels or on diagnosis, but fix on kind of that early screening of where are children in early years in terms of their executive function skills, their oral language skills, and then implement targeted interventions to target those skills that we know are later on going to allow children later on to learn maths, reading. So having kind of these foundational skills, but in order to know who is at risk. So again, we're not giving diagnosis at that young stage, but we're kind of putting at an earlier stage interventions that are a little bit more proactive. And allow the foundations for learning to be embedded within these children. That's what my advice to Keir Starmer.
Super. I put that on a postcard. I will be sending it to number 10. Question from Simon. Simon says, thank you for the talk. I'm an educational psychologist, and I'm aware that we are often called on by schools to recommend interventions and to do some of the translational work from research to practice, as we are trained in scientific methods as well as in educational theory and practice. I think we would also be well placed to contribute to training for educational professionals.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more with that. I know educational psychologists. I mean, I've trained quite a few of them, being placed at the Institute of Education. And I know, you know, to do a fantastic job in terms of, or have a fantastic knowledge around child development, which I think is very important, around what works and how to implement it. But I think we all know that unfortunately, very few educational psychologists these days still have the time within their workload to really address this. So the question is, you know, I think what is required to kind of help the system is not just one approach will fix everything. It's probably, you know, having educators the opportunity in their initial teacher training to learn a little bit more about child development, and then and maybe evaluation methods, and then educational psychologists having a bit more time to kind of top that knowledge up as teachers are within practice or come across particular students in their practice, because of course you can't teach or train teachers on all types of difficulties and conditions that they may come across with. Some of that training will have to take place after initial teacher training. And then some of it will be around, you know, what we're doing with MetaSENse is finding out what are the key components, what are the key targeted interventions, which ones to focus on more than maybe others. I think it's that kind of mosaic approach that is required, but I think educational psychologists are an important part of that as well.
Great, thank you, Joe. Gaia, do you want to ask your question? Oh, can't hear you at the moment. There you go.
Yeah, here you go. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Joe. So fantastic. And I don't want to steal time from many questions in the chat. I was really intrigued by what Debbie was raising, the question about differentiation and modifiability, flexibility of interventions, the tension between that very desirable element, particularly maybe for students with SEND, and fidelity. And I wonder whether amongst the many interventions that you've reviewed, what the proportion would be of interventions that are very clear about their core non-negotiable, non-modifiable ingredients, and the modifiable negotiable ingredients that could allow for differentiation. I'm just not sure that I've seen that very much done, and also then tested empirically in an RCT, for example, that if you maintain those core components but allow other things to change, that actually the outcomes are just as good, or in fact even better than the manualized, really fixed, inflexible interventions. Have you come across, because you've read so many intervention studies, are there any that are very explicit about core components? And
there are a few, and I can't name them on top of my head, but when we were putting the database together, there are a few interventions that might have done an intervention plus another component, or an intervention minus another component, and compared those. But you know, there'll be a handful, like 10 studies that have done that, and very few others. I think, though, what is interesting, I mean, this is something that we debated as the team. Michael Thomas was part of the researchers team as well, is that the fact that the interventions don't seem to be implemented very rigidly or very targetedly or with high fidelity in the research. And then the teachers also want to change it is not a bad thing. Like, you know, we always think that research is very far away from practice, but actually it isn't. It's kind of, the research is kind of mirroring what is happening in practice. And so then the fact that we find these effect sizes seems to be very promising. But yeah, so I think therefore, what I'm meaning by that is that we can then still do this kind of component analysis around what are the critical components from the research interventions only, because it mirrors so much what is happening already in practice. Going back to your question around, are interventions always very explicit about what's the key component? No, and actually in the database, I need to be honest about that, where you have that box that says what is critical about it is a little bit us as the research team reading between the lines and saying, this seems to be an intervention that is very much focused on phonology or phonetics or phonological awareness. That seems to be the key component. But that's us, you know, it's not been empirically evaluated, as you say. Super. Lots of research to be done here, Gaia, you know, but it will require a lot of money.
What I like to see is a big effect size and very poor fidelity. That just tells me the intervention is robust, right? Super. Question from Anna. She says, thank you. I'm currently doing some research and planning an intervention in my school using artificial intelligence. So my question is, what are the latest developments on how AI could benefit SEND pupils in your database?
Oh, very great question. I can give you the answer. We didn't come across any AI because, of course, AI is still very new in terms of just in general, in terms of how widely we use it in the last 2 years. And even the studies that were published in 2023 would have included research that was done in 2020, 21, because it takes time to publish and then to be included in a review. So maybe if we we have the intention of updating the search in the next few years, we might then start picking up some of these interventions. I think for any teacher who's interested in doing an evaluation of the interventions, what is key is the pre and post measures that you're using. And that will be a challenge in terms of what are the the pre and post measures you would use if you have an intervention with AI, and to kind of really carefully think about these measures, because that will be key basically in terms of your findings.
Thanks, Joe. There's a question from 43181. Thank you so much for this presentation. Can schools easily access your data to help choose most effective interventions?
Yes, so the database is free to use. You go to the Center for Educational Neuroscience website. It says MetaSENse, and it will have the data on there in terms of the effect sizes and the data and a reference to the paper. All of the other data of interventions that weren't included in the database, they will be made available once our papers are accepted, and we no longer have to put them under I can't remember the word of it is. Yeah. So, but it will all be made open access available as well.
Super. Caroline asks, would you consider expanding the study and going back further in time with the meta-analysis? 2000 to February 23 is quite a small period of time, especially as COVID happened during this period.
Great question. Again, very few studies of COVID would have been included because they would not have been published in terms of where they were. We could go back further in time, but what we do see is that for the quality of studies seems to decrease a little bit the further we can go in time. So the question is also about how relevant certain studies would still be in terms of the science of learning, what we know are key drivers behind it, etc. So I think it might be at this stage more useful to look at other outcomes and to see what that means rather than going back further in time. But it's a good question. But COVID is not a concern in terms of the studies that were included in this search. If we update our search in a few years, we might need to really think about what do we do with these studies. So thank you for raising that. I'll put it on my list of when we update the database, mind the COVID studies, basically.
Very good. Judy puts a comment in. Thank you for an interesting talk. And she's given a link to a reference guide about interventions that may be relevant by the Early Intervention Foundation. Okay, so that was a helpful resource. Thank you, Judy. So we have got to like 5:10 now. So a proper grilling there for you, Joe. I want to say thank you again so much for your talk and for answering all the fantastic questions today. And do we have another CEN next week? I think we may. I'll have to check the schedule anyway. But if so, tune back in next week. And thanks to everyone for joining today.